Hello everyone, I'm Jasmine, and today we'll be talking about tutorials and how to design them. So this is just a quick overview of the topics we're going to cover. We'll go over what a tutorial is, how to create a good tutorial, these are a list of some of the good practices we're going to cover, and then we'll finish up with some examples of do's and don'ts in tutorial design. So first of all, what is a tutorial? Well, you probably already know this, but a tutorial is something that teaches you how to play the game. Even if your game has really simple and common controls like WASD, it's helpful to list them anyways, just in case your player doesn't know. Something really important to remember about tutorials is that even though their purpose is to teach the player how to play, your tutorial is still part of the game experience. And because tutorials usually appear at the beginning of the game, you want to make it interesting and fun to play so that the player is engaged. If you just throw a wall of text at the player, it'll break their immersion and take away from their experience from the get-go. I'm sure this is relatable for a lot of you all, but when I boot up a game, I just want to start playing right away. I don't want to read through a lot of tutorial to get to the fun parts. To that end, you should think of tutorials as part of the gameplay experience. Make it fun. It should be played through, not read through. And now I'll pass it off to Lucas, who will be covering how to design a good tutorial.
Okay, so now let's go into some strategies that you can use to design a good tutorial. First off, affordances refer to design choices in your game that are self-explanatory to players. These are basically common sense designs that don't require any additional explanation. So, for example, if you see spikes on the floor, they'll probably hurt you, so you don't want to walk onto them. If you see a key, you're going to want to use that to unlock something, and coins are generally good and you want to pick those up. The biggest thing about affordances is that form follows function, and as a reminder, color theory, red equals danger, blue equals safe, etc. If you're designing with affordances, then your game is easy to understand, it's self-explanatory, and everything is just that much more intuitive. Okay, another element that is used in tutorials are skill gates, and basically these are sections of the game where the player is stopped from progressing until they've learned how to use a certain skill. So in this example, this is from Hollow Knight, this guy blocks you from progressing to the next part of the game, and you can't get past him unless you learn like a ranged skill and you learn how to use it on him. Skill gates like these are a good way to ensure that a player has a certain skill set at a certain part of your game. So you're basically guaranteeing that if the player has made it to this part of the game, then they have all the tools that they need to succeed. Something to keep in mind when designing skill gates is that you can also strip away unrelated elements of the game so that the player can focus on learning just this skill. So again, in this example, this room is literally just you and this guy. There's no other people or enemies to distract you. And that's just because it's a lot easier to figure out how to use a new skill if you're not worried about like 10 other enemies trying to kill you at the same time. Okay, another tutorial design strategy is to simply demonstrate a mechanic to the player before letting them try it out for themselves. And this can be achieved by just letting a player witness things that inform them about how the game works. So from this example in Half-Life, the first time you encounter one of these barnacle trap enemies, it snaps up a crow instead of you. And then even though you haven't directly interacted with these traps before, from that point on, you're aware of what they do. Using demonstrative design like this is a really cool way to show the player how the game works rather than simply telling them, and it's also a really great way to maintain immersion. Okay, the next tutorial design choice is trial and error. And what this means is basically introducing a new mechanic to the player and then just letting them have at it and letting them fail. This can be risky because failure is inherently unenjoyable. No one wants to play a game just to like fail over and over again. But at the same time, failure is one of the best ways for anyone to learn a lesson. So if you implement trial and error and make sure that your setback is minimal, then players should still be able to have fun while gaining a first-hand experience of the causality and the consequences of failure in your game. So this is from Limbo. Limbo is a pretty classic example of a game that just throws you into the deep end and lets you figure out how the world works by dying 100 times. I personally really enjoy trial and error designs because then like if the game isn't holding your hand, then like when you do find success, it's just that much more rewarding. Ultimately, trial and error is challenging, but it's rewarding, and it can teach the player a lot. Okay, and finally, When designing tutorials, you can choose to make them context sensitive. And what this generally means is that if a player can't figure something out within a certain time frame, then you can give help to them. So in this Hollow Knight example, at the beginning of the game, the first time you encounter a door, if you stand in front of it for longer than 5 seconds, then the game is just like, hey, you can break this open just by pressing this attack button. And what this does is that it prevents frustration for people who they just can't figure it out. It lets everyone progress. This is more of like an accessibility feature, but it's still pretty important to have. Okay, now let's go over some general tips for tutorial design. First off, if you're making a game that has a lot of mechanics, make sure you don't front load all of the information. Basically, what this means is you don't want to dump all of your game's information onto the player at the very beginning of the game. So this is a screenshot from Streamer's Life. This is their tutorial, and as you can see, there are 5 text boxes on the screen at the same time, all of them explaining mechanics of the game. And this is just a lot of text to read all at once, and there's a pretty high chance that people who play this game will just skip it or skim it really fast, and then when they actually need the information, they will have forgotten it. So a better way to present information is to introduce it as the relevant mechanics appear. So in a lot of games, you don't have access to every single ability at the beginning of the game. You'll get more abilities as you progress, and basically until the player unlocks those abilities, there's really no need to explain something to them that they don't have yet. So a better alternative is to have a tutorial or explanation occur for an ability when the player unlocks it. What this does is that it makes your tutorials digestible and always relevant because the information that you're giving is immediately important. They just received this mechanic, so now they're learning about it. Obviously, this only applies to games where you do gradually unlock skills, and while this is ideal, it won't always be possible. For example, if you're playing Smash Bros, you don't learn new skills, or you don't unlock new skills as you go, you just start out with all of them. So at the end of the day, you have to use your best judgment depending on what kind of game that you're making. But the biggest thing you want to avoid is info dump and massive front loading. Okay, another general tip is to make your tutorial skippable, because if your player has already played this game before, they're on their 3rd playthrough, they really don't want to sit through all of that information all over again. And finally, you want to make sure that your tutorial is accessible at any time. It's definitely common to play a game, put it down for a while, and then by the time you've come back, you've forgotten everything. If you're making a game that has a lot of mechanics, you want to ensure that the player always has the ability to refamiliarize themselves with these mechanics or relearn them. This can be implemented in a lot of ways. You can have an NPC that explains things to you. You can have a button in your UI that just says replay tutorial, etc. For example, in Breath of the Wild, there is this section in your menu UI that just summarizes your main abilities and tells you how to use them. So if you ever need a refresher, you can just hop into the menu. In Pokemon, there's this NPC that you can always go talk to and just have her explain what Pokemon are to you. Okay, so now we'll go into some examples of good and bad tutorial design. The first example is from Ori and the Blind Forest, which in my opinion has really great tutorial design. So Ori is a Metroidvania, which basically means that you learn new skills as you progress. And in Ori, you learn these skills from these spirit trees. So the way Ori teaches you how to use these skills is that it places these trees in an area such that you have to immediately use the new skill to continue the game. So for example, the tree that teaches you wall climb is placed in a pit with high walls. And as soon as you learn a skill, you have to use it to get right back out. Another example is it puts breakable ground next to the tree that teaches you how to stomp. And these are examples of skill gates, because once you learn how to use a new skill, the game does not let you continue until you've proven that you know how to use it. Okay, cool. Now Jasmine will continue giving examples of good and bad tutorial design.
Mario is a really good example of a demonstrative tutorial, so much so that it doesn't even feel like a tutorial at all. Mario starts off with a lot of empty space on his right. That gives the player time to get familiarized with their controls. The fact that he starts off on the left side of the screen, facing right, is also really important because it shows the player that the objective is to move right. After you walk forwards, you encounter your first enemy, the Goomba. The only way to get over the Goomba is to jump, so this teaches you how to jump. It also acts like a skill gate because there's no other way to get past the Goomba. The player must learn how to jump before they can continue the game. It's also a really forgiving skill gate because if you do get killed by the Goomba, you just restart at the beginning again, a few feet from where you died. So without using any text or visual indicators, Mario's first level teaches the player how to move around, the objective of the game, and how to jump. Now that we've talked about some good tutorials, let's talk about some bad tutorials. Doom Eternal is a fast-paced action game where you kill a bunch of demons, but when you first pick up the chainsaw, the game teleports you to a different room so it can teach you how to use the weapon. This totally breaks immersion because you're killing a bunch of enemies, it's super fast-paced, and suddenly you get teleported to this white room for a tutorial sequence. Pokemon 2 has some pretty annoying tutorials. In pretty much every game, there's someone who walks up to you and starts an unskippable tutorial sequence where they teach you how to catch a Pokemon. This is really annoying because if this is not your first Pokemon game, you're already a ball-throwing master, so making the tutorial skippable would be so much more preferable. And lastly, Monster Hunter is an action game where you can hunt big monsters. So it's super action-heavy, exciting, you get to kill things, etc. But when you first start the game, you always have to finish this series of gathering quests, where you literally just gather plants for 10 minutes. That's the quest. So this is really annoying for players, because most people want to get right into the action and not spend time picking up herbs. These herb gathering quests feel really separated from the rest of the gameplay experience. Alright, so now you know how to make a good engaging tutorial. So you might be asking yourself, where do I start? One thing you shouldn't do is put this off until the very end. Oftentimes, the tutorial design will also affect the game design. For example, going back to not front-loading your player. Maybe you'll need to change up the design of your levels to make a good tutorial. So it's important to make a tutorial while you're developing the rest of your game. And a good way to start figuring out what kind of tutorial you need and how much information the player needs in order to play your game is through playtests. Because sometimes you've played your game so many times while developing it that the mechanics that may seem obvious to you are not obvious at all to someone who's never touched your game. A good way to see how much tutorial your game needs is by having someone playtest it. When they're playtesting it, don't talk to them at all. Don't tell them the controls, the mechanics, just, don't tell them anything. See how much they can figure out on their own, and see what mechanics or controls they struggle with. This way, you can separate the obvious controls with the less obvious ones, and see which mechanics you might need to explicitly introduce versus ones that might be implicitly understood. And that's it! Tutorials are important to teach the player how to play your game, but they should be fun and enjoyable too. Try using affordances, skill gates, trial and error, context-sensitive tutorials, and avoid front-loading to create an engaging tutorial. To get started, you can use playtests as an opportunity to find out what kind of tutorial you need. And lastly, start making tutorials now. Since tutorial design can influence your game design, it's better to get started earlier than later. And that's it! Here are some resources in case you want to learn more about tutorial design. And yeah, that concludes the tutorial lecture. Hope you guys keep these tips in mind while making your own tutorials, and don't forget to fill out the lecture quiz linked in the description.